We're fortunate to have Jeff Ansell here today to talk about his book, When the Headline Is You. At Google, we can appreciate both sides of news stories of the type that Jeff writes about. One side, you're worried that your words are going to be twisted. You feel that the journalists are predators trying to force things out of you that you don't believe, don't want to say. On the other side, we read articles that are just BS. We see interviews where the questions aren't being answered. Jeff, from his background in journalism and then advising people how to talk to journalists, helps us navigate the middle ground, how to actually answer questions, how to not be a stonewall and not be prey. And as a result, I think what he has to say is really relevant to those of us at Google. No further ado, Jeff, he's here to talk to us about his book, When the Headline Is You, and I hope you all have a chance to read it soon.
Thank you very much, David. Hey, everybody.
Hi.
How's everyone today? Good, good. First of all, I want to thank you folks for the invitation to be here. I'm very grateful. And thank you for having the interest to be here as well. I am a media and crisis communications advisor. What I do is I help companies and governments and individuals when they're caught smack dab in the glare of the media spotlight, and sometimes when the news isn't very good, and in fact oftentimes controversial. I find myself working most often in cases that can be considered tough, high profile, no-win situations. I worked on the Aaron Brockovich case in California. I've trained White House spokespeople. I just finished a stint with the Vancouver Olympics. I play a very modest role as a faculty member of the Public Disputes program at Harvard Law School. I help instruct in the course Dealing with an Angry Public, which starts tomorrow, right next door, by the way. And I also have the opportunity to lecture annually at Harvard Business School in the course Negotiation Dynamics. And what I do is I work with the MBA students to help them gain a degree of sensitivity to the impact of values and emotion and communication on the negotiation process. So in the time that we have this morning, I'm hoping that we can share some thoughts, a couple of ideas about the state of journalism today. Also, I'd like to chat about why I wrote the book and share with you some stories from my days as a journalist. And I invite you every step along the way, please feel free to stop me, ask questions. I'll do my very best to answer as we go along. If I may, I'd like to very briefly read just a few paragraphs from the book that I think sets the tone for what this is all about. It's from the book's introduction. Answering questions from reporters is risky business. Though a media interview may feel like a straightforward conversation, it actually represents a contrived and manipulative dynamic. Knowing how to talk to reporters is actually like learning a new language. And it bears little, if any, resemblance to everyday conversation, and it's a mistake for anyone to believe otherwise. It may seem as if speaking the truth should be enough to build credibility and trust, but that's not the case. Exposing oneself to media scrutiny requires more than simple candor. It requires knowledge, training, and a keen understanding of how reporters write the news. And in my nearly 40 years of experience doing this, I've yet to meet anyone for whom media skills come naturally. Answering tough questions is difficult even for reporters themselves. You'd think that being skilled in asking questions would provide insight in how to answer them. I discovered otherwise, however, in a training session that I conducted in Washington for famed Watergate journalist Carl Bernstein. In the training, my first question to Carl was about his troubled relationship with his Watergate partner, Bob Woodward, and to my surprise, Carl put his foot in his mouth so deeply it came out the other end, and I learned something important that day. Anyone can ask questions. The real skill is in answering them. So it should be a little surprise then that many executives and government leaders and spokespeople are reluctant to engage the news media. Their concern is justified. People who talk to the media are only as good as their worst quote. Though someone answering a reporter's question may strike all the right notes for the majority of the interview, it takes only a single miscue to trigger disaster. One misstatement to a reporter can destroy long-held goodwill or cause a company's share price to plummet. And I think legendary investor Warren Buffett said it best: it takes 20 years to build a reputation, 5 minutes to ruin it. Actually, probably in this day and age, less than 5 minutes. I was a pretty aggressive reporter. When I used to show up for work every day, my editors used to say to me, well, Jeff, whose life are you going to ruin today? I was oftentimes about as popular as a pig at a bar mitzvah. Now that I'm out of journalism, I've had opportunity to think about why I got into it in the first place. And it's funny, I didn't see any of this when I was in it for 20 years, but I became a reporter, I think in part because I grew up angry. My late father was a factory worker, and I recall the callous way in which he was treated. And it made me upset that decent people were treated in a very disrespectful fashion by their employers, and it made me want to fight on behalf of the little guy. And being a reporter let me do that. I didn't become a reporter right away though. I left school at age 16. I sold encyclopedias door to door. I was a dishwasher. I was a factory worker. I worked in a couple of different factories. I worked in a pantyhose factory where I used to sew the legs and the pantyhose together for 3 cents a dozen. I didn't make very much money. And I worked in a clothing factory as well. My parents were very upset because I was supposed to be a professional, and how the heck did I end up doing this? And one day when I was in the factory, I called in sick because I was able to get an audition for a local radio station. And I was 16 years old, but I told them I was 19. I told them I was going to university, even though I hadn't even completed high school. And I did the audition, and I thought I did a lousy job, and I went back to the factory the next day, and then I got a phone call, not at the factory, but to my house, telling me that I got the job. So, though I terribly upset my parents, the book is dedicated to my mother and father, so things came together. And by the way, that pantyhose factory was mistreating its employees. I did an investigation on them when I became a reporter, so they got what was coming to them. And the other ironic thing is a clothing factory where I used to be a shipper and I used to schlep all these bundles on my back. They later provided my wardrobe when I was a TV news anchor, so it's nice the way things turned around. When I was a reporter, I was very grateful to do a whole bunch of interesting things. And there was one story that changed everything for me. It was about a young boy named Kevin. He was about 8 years old, and Kevin didn't have a family. He was in foster care, and he kept getting shunted from one home to another. And he was a very sad little boy. And I did a documentary on adoption, and I focused on Kevin. And to this day, I often think that if Kevin found a home, it's probably one of the most important things I've ever done in my life, if he found a home as a result of that story. And that's when I realized the power of the pen and the camera. We can get an awful lot done. As one of the stories I worked on, I posed undercover as a drug addict for 12 months to expose doctors who were pushing drugs. And I wired myself with a hidden microphone, and I went to visit these docs every week for a year, never once asking for drugs, never once did they examine me. And I can tell you that I collected an awful lot of drugs from those guys. I put them all in a safe because the federal authorities came to count the drugs after. And I'm grateful to say that both docs lost their licenses and got what was coming to them. I spent 12 months tracking Nazi war criminals here in the United States and in Canada. Found a couple of these guys. I got one shipped back to Western Europe for trial, exposed the others. It was most distasteful to work on that story. I hated every single minute of it. And when I was looking at the evidence that showed how terrible these people were and how they destroyed innocent lives, I wanted to put my hands around their necks and do the job myself. But thankfully, we caught them. I spent a year investigating nursing homes where I live. I planted spies inside homes because people weren't being treated right. And I'm grateful to say we closed up one home and we got some amendments to the nursing home laws in the community where I live. I had a great run in journalism, and then one day something happened. We were going to go on the air for the 6 o'clock news on TV, and we didn't really have a lead story that day. All we had was a stabbing, and I never liked to lead the newscast with a stabbing because as terrible as a stabbing is, in a major market station, you'd think there'd be something a little more of significance for everybody in the community. And it was about 10 to 6, and as we were getting ready to go on the air, the assignment editor got on the loudspeaker and he announced to the room, "Good news, we have a lead story, the stabbing victim died." And and the newsroom erupted in a cheer. And that was the day I left journalism. And it just been getting to me, and that put me over the edge. So I thought, let me take everything I've learned in the past 20 years and apply it to another purpose. And that's why I became what's called a media and crisis communications coach, media trainer. I help people deal with the news media because it's sharing a natural playing field now. I know myself that when I was a reporter, I say, with great respect to the people I interviewed, I can get anybody to say anything I want. And I kind of feel bad about that now in some cases, but I'm still in the process of seeking redemption, and this book is part of that. Because the process of answering questions from media, as I said earlier from the introduction, is very unnatural. It can be like learning a new language. It's stilted, it's scheming, it's manipulative, it can be conniving. But I want to be clear here. I didn't write this book to bash the media. I'm very, very grateful for many of the things I had an opportunity to do as a reporter. I shared some with you. It's a noble calling. And I'll always stay in my head, it'll always stay in my head the quote by Thomas Jefferson, who said, "I'd rather have newspapers without government than government without newspapers." Now, there has been a revolutionary shift in how news is produced and how news is consumed, and that's thanks in large part to you folks at Google. Because the fact of the matter is, today, anyone can be a reporter. In fact, Matt Drudge said, we're all newsmen now. The problem is that we're seeing a continual dumbing down of the news these days. I mean, just in the last week alone, what have some of the stories been? Paris Hilton will stop bullying people on his website. That's in the news. Bristol Palin was turfed off Dancing with the Stars. That was in the news. Keith Richards writes a book and describes Mick Jagger's private parts. That's in the news, believe it or not. And so this is something that's quite concerning, and there are a number of reasons for this dumbing down phenomena. First of all, fewer consumers of news are looking for thoughtful public policy discourse. We're told by so-called experts about diminished attention spans that viewers, listeners, readers have these days. Newsrooms themselves are experiencing a great many cutbacks. People are losing their jobs. You have reporters who are doing more with less. Now you have some reporters who'll work for the paper, and they got to schlep around a TV camera with them because they got to upload the information, the video to the web. They got to keep writing stories for the web, and it's a lot of work on them now. And what it is, it's research on the run, and they're writing history in a hurry. The problem is, I think it's just too easy to become media roadkill. It's too easy for decent, innocent people to say something that they wish they hadn't have said. And there's a lot of casualties along the way, because it's very easy to become negative and defensive and argumentative when you're dealing with a reporter. And why? Because reporters approach stories from a predetermined perspective. It's almost a paint-by-numbers approach. And I didn't realize any of this when I was a journalist. I had to get the distance to figure this out. But if you look at any controversial story, it's a predictable cast of characters. If you have controversy, the first character you need is the victim. And I'm not trivializing, but somebody's got to get hurt. If you have a victim, it means you need to have a villain. If you have a villain and you have a victim, it means you need to have a hero, somebody who's riding in to save the day. Then you have the character that I call the witness, who saw the whole darn thing happen. And then there's the character I call the expert. And when I was a reporter, I used to try to put the expert into a white lab coat so they'd look official. And it'd be part of a narrative. They wouldn't even have to speak. They'd look as if they were expert. And then there's the character that I call the village idiot. And the village idiot is the one who really gums everything up for everybody. And the risk oftentimes is that the villain and the village idiot can be one and the same. And I say respectfully, if you look at the recent BP debacle, the villain, of course, was BP itself, and the village idiot may in fact have been the President Tony Hayward, who of course said a few things to the media that I'm sure he regrets. But it's not even controversial stories that can pose risk. Even good news stories, or stories that are supposed to be good news, can be problematic. John Walter was named leader of AT&T. They held a news conference to announce it, and then one of the reporters says to him, "Mr. Walter, who was your service provider?" And Walter didn't know how to answer. I don't know. And that day, AT&T's market cap plummeted $4 billion. Now, if you were advising John Walter, what's the best answer for that question? What do you think?
AT&T.
Pardon me? Okay, AT&T, fine, you could get away with it, but it's a lie. Okay, but we really don't want to lie to the media because they're smart and they'll figure it out, and it doesn't look good because once they tag you as a liar, it sticks. What's another possible alternative? Mr. Walter, who's your service provider? And you haven't got a clue. What do you say?
What do you think?
Oh, I'll tell you in a second. I want to hear what you think.
No, what do you think?
What do I think?
No, let's reply. What do you think?
Oh, what do you think? Okay, I think it's AT&T, sir. Am I right? And we're back where we started from.
You can lie.
You can lie, but it's not. We don't counsel that.
Starting in an hour, it'll be AT&T.
That's the best answer. Or something along the lines of, regardless of who it's been, it's AT&T from now on.
Right.
Okay. Anyway, it was just that was the signal of a very terrible time for John Walter, and he didn't last terribly long at AT&T. But most every company is one sentence away from disaster. That's all it takes. Look at Tony Hayward, our friend from BP. Remember his quote? What was his famous quote? I want my life back. Now here's the thing. It's quite conceivable that Tony Hayward, when he made that comment, made a number of other comments. Let's presume he delivered 10 sentences, and 9 of them were genuine and heartfelt. And one sentence was, and he probably didn't even mean it in a selfish way, but, geez, I want my life back. Well, you know, you don't have to be a journalism professor from Columbia University to figure out that's the one quote they're going to use, because you are only as good as your worst quote. And the thing is, people oftentimes, they'll read the paper the next day, they'll watch TV, they'll see a quote like that getting used, and you know what they're going to say? It's predictable. Where's the rest of what I said? They took me out of context. No, they weren't taken out of context, they were edited. And that's one of the things I do, is I share with people strategies and techniques to make sure that every single sentence that comes out of your mouth is honest, number one, and that it works in your favor. But again, it's too easy for reasonably intelligent people to put their foot in their mouths. Sunrise Hospital, example, in New York, part of the Columbia hospital system. They had a terrible situation happen not long ago when a homeless man showed up at the emergency room door. And he went to the front desk and he said, please, I have terrible chest pains. Can I see a doctor? And the woman behind the counter said, well, sir, I need your insurance card. He said, ma'am, I'm homeless. I know I smell. I know I'm dirty, but I have a real bad chest pain. Can you please help me see a doctor? Sir, I need your insurance. Anyway, what happened was they walked him out the front door, and about 30 feet from the front door, what do you think happens? He keels over and he dies. He was a young man, he was in his 30s. So ABC News, Primetime Live, does an investigation. And Brian Ross, who's a very good reporter, is probably one of the best reporters around today, investigative reporters. He's interviewing the PR person at Sunrise Hospital. And he says to her, well, what's your reaction to the fact that your emergency room turned down this man because he didn't have insurance? And she got all defensive. And finally she says, look it, we're all gonna die. Now, you know, if you're Brian Ross and you hear that quote, you know you just struck oil. But the papers are riddled on a regular basis with people saying dumb things. Remember that earthquake in Italy about a year or so ago? Silvio Berlusconi, the Prime Minister of Italy, remember what he said to all the people who lost their homes? Pretend you're on vacation, go to the beach, go camping. You know, and those are negative stories, but a negative story doesn't even have to be true in order for it to get legs. More than 100 years ago, Mark Twain said, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And that was before television, before radio, before the internet. So how much more true is that today? And I can tell you that whether a person is dealing with a negative situation that's real or not real, there's a particular response pattern that people fall into. And you may notice this on the news when you're seeing people who are being interviewed, oftentimes reluctantly. When somebody is confronted by a reporter, the first thing they do is they stop breathing. The second thing they do is they stop listening. The third thing they do is they feverishly say to themselves, how am I going to answer? How am I going to answer? The fourth thing they do is they start arguing. And the fifth thing they do is they have an out-of-body experience. And then, of course, when the story comes out and they're very upset about it, what's their complaint going to be? Where's the rest of what I said? They took me out of context. You see, what a lot of people have to realize is that when they're mired in bad news, all the facts in the world aren't going to change anybody's opinion. Because bad news is driven by emotion. And just about every bad news story that's out there has emotion attached to it. You know, we deliver the Dealing with an Angry Public course at MIT Harvard. And we get a bunch of people who take the course, usually from the ugliest sectors around. You get nuclear people, and sometimes you get people from tobacco. Get the gun lobby sometimes comes. And oftentimes, somebody will stand up at the beginning of a program. Usually it's an engineer, with great respect. And the engineer will say to everybody, the reason we're taking the program Dealing with an Angry Public is because we want to help our angry publics learn how to strip away emotion so they focus only on fact. And we get a good laugh out of that. Because if it's a battle between fact and emotion, in the court of public opinion, emotion is always going to win. Now in the court of law, or in the regulatory world, facts will prevail. But most people fight their battles in the court of public opinion. And they often fight their cause by using traditional public relations strategies. And those strategies don't work anymore, because one public relations strategy that has been used and used and used is the one where the message is the mantra. Over and over and over again, the individual will repeat the same message, regardless of the question that's asked. And it just makes them look foolish, because each time they repeat the same question over and over again, it strips away a layer of sincerity from them. And they think, well, I'll show the reporter there's no way she's going to get me, because I'll just keep saying my message over and over again. But what I used to do when I was a reporter is I would feature my question and the answer. And if I asked them 5 times, and 5 times they gave the same dumb response, I would feature that in my story. And so who looks foolish now? The other mistake that traditional public relations strategies make is to overwhelm people with data. Well, you know, let me just share what the numbers indicate here. And, you know, if you look at the parts per million, they come in. It doesn't work. In part because the information that people deliver comes from them, and it's not credible when it comes from them. It has to come from a credible third-party source. The other thing is that very often people in bad news are reluctant to refute the concerns of angry people. They don't want to engage angry people. So if people are suffering, very often a company or organization will not want to acknowledge it. Why? Because it gives credence to their perspective, it gives credence to their arguments. And so it makes people angrier when a company refuses to acknowledge the harm it may have done, or at least acknowledge the fact that some people perceive there's been harm. Because when you're dealing with upset people, there's 2 things they want. The second thing they want is fix my problem. The first thing they want is for you to acknowledge it. And what often stands in the way, of course, are lawyers. Lawyers have the ear of the CEO. And the lawyer's expertise is in protecting the company in a court of law, and that's why the lawyer exercises too much influence around the table. The problem, of course, is that a lawyer will save you $100 million in a court of law and cost you $1 billion in the court of public opinion in terms of law sales and so on. So who's the winner there? Also, traditional public relations strategies tell you that if you're a spokesperson, never use a negative word. Never use, even if it's a terrible situation. I was training somebody, it was a plant manager, a whole bunch of plant managers, and we were simulating that day an accident at the factory. And in the accident simulation, there were fatalities. And so my question to the plant manager in our simulation was, what's your response to the deaths that took place in your factory today? And he says to me, well, you know, we're very proud of our safety record. Excuse me? How can you say that given the fact that there are people dead? And what did he tell me? He had media training. And the media trainer told him, never say anything negative, which is absolute baloney and nonsense. Because sometimes you do have to use negative words. Otherwise, people just aren't going to believe you. If you're in a situation where there's a high degree of concern and a low degree of trust, and it's difficult to carry on your day-to-day business affairs, and you're on the front page of the newspaper above the fold, and they're talking about you either in Congress or in the state legislature, then it's time to use negative words. And a great example of that would be the JetBlue debacle of a few years ago, when the airline pretty well came to a standstill, stranded many hundreds of thousands of customers, after David Neilman, who was the president at the time, came out and said, I'm ashamed, I'm embarrassed, this never should have happened. A lot of people were very, very inconvenienced, and we apologize for that. But a lot of people are even afraid to apologize. Again, why? Because it's the lawyer. If you apologize, it's going to put us on the hook. There was a story in Canada involving the bad blood scare. Remember when the tainted blood was out there? Red Cross around the world was sourcing blood from San Francisco prisons, if you can believe it. And a lot of people got hepatitis and the AIDS virus. And in Canada, they held a royal commission to investigate why this was happening. And the president of Red Cross was appearing before the judge, and the judge said to him, his name was Douglas Lindors, the president, the judge said to him, Mr. Lindors, do you now apologize to all those people who've been victimized as a result of the inept actions of Red Cross? And the president of Red Cross said, well, Your Honor, it's not that easy. And the judge said, well, Mr. Lindors, I think it is very easy. Yes or no, do you apologize? Your Honor, I'm going to have to consult. Sir, yes or no, do you apologize? And the headline the next day, Red Cross refuses apology. Of course, he's the former CEO of Red Cross. But we should know that very often an apology goes an awful long way towards mitigating damages in a bad news situation. I write about one company, the Covenant Transportation Group here in the United States. Every day, its trucks travel 1 million miles here in the United States alone. They got 25,000 trucks on the road. And terrible things happen now and again. And they have a policy, a new policy, that whenever one of their trucks is involved in an accident or even a fatality, the president of the company and the lawyer will call up the family and they'll say, we're sorry for what we caused. We apologize. Is there anything we can do to help you in the meantime? And of course, the lawyer for the family is saying, get off the phone. They're trying to fool you. Get off the phone. And the company says, look, do what you have to do. Please sue us. Do whatever you have to do. We understand that. But in the meantime, is there a mortgage payment? Is there a tuition payment? Is there something we can do to help? And their insurance premiums have plummeted. They're saving an awful lot of dough. Same thing with the Michigan health system. They have a more forthcoming policy. Because it used to be docs would circle the wagon and would refuse to acknowledge a problem. But now they've seen the merits of this way. And by the way, in 35 states across the United States, there is the Apology Act. 4 Canadian provinces have the Apology Act as well. What that allows a company to do is apologize without it being used as an admission of liability in court. And it's a very, very popular piece of legislation that hopefully will spread. Because when bad news happens on your watch, you have to be amongst those who's most aggravated, most upset, most discouraged, and most aggrieved. So, my hope is that when the headline is you, we'll find several audiences. I hope it'll be of interest to folks who are consumers of news, who are interested in how news is gathered, reported, interpreted. I'm hoping as well the book will be of interest to public relations people and spokespeople. Journalists, I hope, will find interest in it, although it's many of the journalists, of course, will look to these techniques and will try to find them when they're interviewing people. But the whole book talks about taking an honest, ethical, and forthcoming approach to dealing with the media. So it should be something that will, in some cases, stymie journalists, but they're getting the truth nonetheless. And I'm hoping as well it'll be of value to students of both public relations and journalism as well. And overall, I hope that what the book will do is take those of us who are right now passive consumers of news, we watch TV, we're not even thinking, we read the paper, we're not even thinking. I'm hoping that this book will turn people from passive consumers of news into sophisticated consumers of news. Folks, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm very grateful. Thank you. Thank you, David. questions, please.
First, thanks so much for joining us, Jeff. My name is Durand, and I was hoping that maybe we could deconstruct, I believe her name was Shirley Sherrod, the woman who had given a speech about not wanting to have lent dollars to a white family. Shirley herself was African American. Then she went on to say that she had a moment of mindfulness and realized that she was imparting some bias and did grant the family the dollars they needed.
Right.
And then the video was subsequently heavily edited to in fact make her look like a racist. You could say the same thing happened with Acorn recently, right? With the pimp coming in with his prostitute and making it look like Acorn was helping them, when in fact Acorn was supplying or gathering information to supply to the police. And I'm wondering, in this world of YouTube and really heavy editing, where in fact you can make an apple look like an orange, what advice do you have to CEOs or to those who are in the public media to make sure that their true message is coming through? Because once the damage is done, it's done, right?
Thank you, Durand. Well, first of all, learn how to do it. Because you get intelligent, articulate people who think that because they're glib and they present well, that they know how to communicate in media. And so they're the ones who often put their foot in their mouths the deepest. In the case of that woman, it was a matter of context. Now, the reporters chose to focus on that particular quote that said she was going to deny the loan. And of course, they didn't feature the other quotes as well. The secret is to make every sentence out of your mouth exist as what I call a standalone statement. You see, you can answer a question with 4 sentences. The problem oftentimes is sentence number 1 makes no sense until you hear sentence number 2, which by itself is incomplete until you hear sentence number 3, and then the whole thing is tied together in sentence number 4. And then you open the paper tomorrow and you only see yourself delivering sentence number 2, and you say, of course, where's the rest of what I said? They took me out of context. You see, when you, as a spokesperson, when you weave your sentences together, you're building a house of cards. Because you never know which 1, 2, 3, or 4 quotes the journalist is going to use. So the idea, I believe, is to create standalone statements that exist as silos, so that the message I'm delivering now makes sense regardless of whether you hear what I said before or whether you hear what I say after. Each sentence has to be able to make sense on its own. So Durand, that's probably the best way to have some degree of influence over the way stories are edited.
Hey Jeff, thanks for coming once again. Name's Patrick. I hope I'm not too presumptuous, but I'm going to consider you an old school journalist.
I've been called worse.
And going off that, I'd really love to get your opinion on, kind of bouncing off Durand's question, with the rise of your Glenn Becks, your Rachel Maddow's, these kind of journalists, but I would say new school, or kind of what you touched on with YouTube, and anyone can kind of be a journalist. Do you think that we're losing the credible discourse that kind of was present in your heyday, and subsequently we're losing the fourth estate? Kind of, we're seeing the death of the fourth estate in the 21st century?
I think, Patrick, to a certain extent we are. Part of this dumbing down of news is turning news into entertainment. And the Glenn Becks of this world and others have seized the spotlight. There's very little thoughtful public policy discussion on the TV anyway. Maybe you'll catch an hour or 2 on Sunday morning. But even CNN isn't terribly deep these days. And the journalists themselves have turned everything into a sporting contest. Like, we have an election happening here in the United States tomorrow. Where's the thoughtful discussion about the issues? Poverty, hunger, education. It's like a sporting contest. There's going to be winners and losers, smart and stupid, competent and incompetent, because that's the way the world interprets these days. And reporters also, I'm not saying it was right, but there was a time when certain matters were off limits. You know, and again, I'm not saying that they should have done this. President Kennedy's sex life, for instance. And now look, you know, we know too much detail about President Clinton and his own particular sex life. So there's no boundaries anymore. And that I find very, very disturbing. And we don't see enough venues for thoughtful journalism these days, especially with all the job cuts that are taking place. People are losing their jobs left, right, and center in newsrooms. And they're having to rely on wire services and so on. And so everybody's getting the same news. There's not a proliferation of different opinion out there, and we, the people, are suffering as a result.
People saying they're getting the best news from the Comedy Channel, which is sad but true, actually.
Did you see President Obama on Jon Stewart's show last week? Unbelievable. The President of the United States is on the Comedy Channel doing an interview with Jon Stewart. It's a hoot to watch. The President was totally defensive, was totally without humor, and the messages he delivered just failed to resonate on that particular program. Stewart, to his credit, knows he's a comedian, so he was trying to make jokes, but the President just wasn't connecting, and that's a problem he's having these days. But that's how desperate people are to get their message out, that they'll go to where they think the people are listening. In that case, it's the Comedy Channel.
So speaking of that, what did you think of Eric Schmidt on Colbert?
I didn't see that. Forgive me. Can you share?
Well, the greatest one was Colbert gave him this zinger line where he said, "Well, didn't you say that teenagers at around age 15 should be able to give up their whole past and start fresh?" And Schmidt looks at him and said, "That was a joke." But another question, how do you deal with the kind of reporter who basically has written the story first, knows what your opinion is, has cast you in the role, and then sort of whatever you say is going to be, quote, edited to reinforce that?
We can't control how the reporter writes her story. What we can control are the quotes that come out of our mouths. And yes, they do paint by numbers. They paint by numbers because there's a lot of demand on them and they got to cover quite a few stories. And so very often they leave a slot open for the villain or the village idiot. And they ask questions that are designed to bring out the villainy or the fact that the person is incompetent. If a spokesperson recognizes that that's the game that's being played and is taking an honest, forthcoming approach, even though they are being targeted as the villain or the village idiot, they can represent themselves appropriately without putting their foot deep in their mouths, without putting their foot in their mouths at all. You see, what's really important, I think, is for every spokesperson who's mired in a bad news situation to always start off by asking themselves, what am I made of? What are the words that I would use to describe how I want my stakeholders to see me and perceive me as I deal with this terrible situation? So let's say we're dealing with BP or Toyota. BP, what are the words that describe how we want our stakeholders to see us? What are the words, folks? Resilient. Strong. Well, here's the thing. Who's the audience? I'm going to lean towards compassion, because here's the deal. At the height of the crisis, BP's audience, yes, it's got different audiences. It's got its shareholders and investors, yes, but it's got the general public as well. And what's said in the general public is going to influence what happens to the share price and whether people are going to feel comfortable investing in the company. So I think at a time like this, words like compassion, trustworthy, accountable, are words that are important. I think that for the shareholders and those messages, strong, resilient, very important. But even then, there has to be a degree of acknowledgement of the terrible thing that's taken place. And then the idea is to take every message you deliver, every question you answer, every policy you have responsibility for, and to filter it through this prism. Because what this does is it gives you a path, it gives you a plan, it gives you a direction. And at the end of the day, they're not going to love you. Spilled all this oil. We ain't going to love you. But if maybe the general public hates the company just a little bit less, then that's the victory. Please.
Yeah, I have a question. I'd like your reaction to this opinion that someone I know who grew up under communism has of the American journalism system. It says, people in America, in her opinion, are much more easily influenced by the media because they grew up trained to believe that we have a free press. Under communism, we all knew that it was all lies.
I really do believe we have a free press here. The problem is that it's what we're being fed these days in the press. That's why it's good to have a variety of sources for your news, not to depend on any one particular news outlet.
So is the best media strategy to kind of fall into this existing paradigm of winners and losers and to portray yourself as this winner or as the subject of media attention? Is the onus on you to call out the context and to try to broaden the conversation and to to call that out. I guess I'm not articulating this.
No,
well,
you
but I
are.
think whose responsibility is it to question this paradigm? Obviously, the person answering a media inquiry is first and foremost self-interested, but is there a responsibility to address the larger problem?
It depends on the situation. If it's a situation that's societal and systemic, perhaps there may be an opportunity to broaden the context. But if it's a company that's smack dab mired in the middle of a problem that it owns, it just has to do its very best to come out of it. But these are questions that we as consumers of news ought to be asking as well. Because reporters sure as heck don't have time to ask themselves these questions. They're too busy, getting the story out for the, churning out sausages for the next meal. But these are important questions that spokespeople have to ask, and that we, those of us who consume the news, have to ask as well.
Jeff, do you have any particular insights on Google's image in the press these days? We've had a lot of conflict in the press, you could say, predatory seeming stories.
Well, I heard of one story that received some coverage involving a breach of trust, David, that had taken place. And I didn't hear about it through the media. I heard about it through word of mouth. And it didn't become big news to Google's benefit. But when bad news happens, you have to be the one who's most aggrieved, as I said earlier, most outraged. Very often when a company tries to, defend itself in the court of public opinion, when an ugly issue, something blatantly wrong takes place, the story starts off on, in the front section on page 12. And then as they continue not to own it, it moves to page 8. Still not going to own it, it moves to page 4. Still refusing to own it, it moves to page 1, top of the fold. And you know what happens then? They own it. So perhaps this particular organization was got off in a very easy way in dealing with that particular situation. Because I never heard about it in the media, but that's ultimately what a company wants. Durant?
Maybe a philosophical question, but why does the bad always win? On that day that you left broadcasting, I could imagine that there were hundreds of other good things that happened. But why do you think the bad always takes the top story?
I think it's for the same reason that people slow their cars to look at accidents on the highway on the other side. Because there's that curiosity. In the case of the newsroom, though, it's just an insensitivity. Reporters are faced up every day terrible things in life, and so some of them fight back by becoming insensitive to it. I know that when I was a reporter, one of the things they used to ask me to do is, if somebody experienced a death in the family due to a murder or some terrible accident, they used to ask me to go to the house and get a picture of the deceased so we'd have it for tomorrow's paper, tonight's news. And I used to do it, and I used to feel terrible. I was like 19, 20 years old. And then as I got older, I realized this is wrong. The last person in the world that this family wants to see right now is me. And it got to a point where I refused to go. I said, I'm not gonna go. Not doing it. No, I'm not covering the funeral. Not gonna do it. Because there is that insensitivity. And what is news? News is drama, it's irony, it's controversy, it's emotion, it's conflict above all. News very rarely is good news. I mean, unless there's a breakthrough in cancer medications and so on. But most news isn't that good. And that's why people buy the papers, and that's why people tune into the news.
If there are no other questions now, let's wrap up. Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff.